Welcome, everybody. Thank you for hopping on with us. My name is Kenzie Kimmel. I am a 4-H agent out of Adams County. And tonight we have invited Kyndal. Kyndal, I am not going to try your last name, so I'm going to let you introduce yourself with that. Kyndal is currently the Colorado State University Livestock Judging Coach and Coordinator, and she has been gracious enough to volunteer her time and her expertise to teach us tonight about market hog and market sheep and goat selection for your 4-H projects. I know that everybody, if you guys haven't just bought your animals, you're probably going to sales or visiting producers this weekend or in the next weekend or so. So we're really grateful to have Kyndal on for us tonight. So as she goes through her presentation, you guys, if you have questions, feel free to type them into the chat if you don't want to forget about them. She'll pause every now and then and ask if there's questions, and so you're welcome to unmute at those times, or if you've put something in the chat, then I will help relay those questions to her. So questions are fantastic. And you guys are all on the newer end of 4-H. So again, everybody's probably wondering the same thing you are. So with that, Kyndal, thank you very much for joining us tonight. And I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit, how you came to your position with the CSU judging team. And then I will let you take it away.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And quite a deal and exciting that you guys kind of put this together, and I feel very fortunate to be a part of it. I apologize. I'm sitting in my car doing this. I have had a crazy day, so I apologize to you guys. I should be in the office, but I'm in my car instead. So a little bit about me. I am originally from Kersey, Colorado, about 15 minutes east of Greeley. Grew up there with my family, showing livestock there in Weld County. I then continued on to Redlands Community College in Oklahoma, El Reno, Oklahoma, to judge there in junior college, and then transferred to Oklahoma State University and judged there for 2 years. And then I actually completed my master's there at OSU for 2.5 years and helped coach the team where we were national champions back to back. And then after that, I decided I wanted to come home for a little while. So I've been home and here for about 3 years. And been here at CSU for going on 3 years, and been the livestock judging coach there at CSU. So this team that I have now actually will be my final team at CSU, but I've completed 2 full teams and really, really enjoyed it. I grew up showing cattle and pigs, but help quite a bit with 4-H kids just around the state on kind of their projects and picking out stuff. And so with that being said, we will go ahead and dive into the market hog evaluation to kind of start us off. So when we talk about the selection criteria for selecting swine show projects as baby pigs, and really this kind of discusses how we judge them as big hogs too, but everything kind of incorporates into one. So some things that you look for when selecting hogs: muscle, optimal leanness, product orientation, so skeletal width and dimension, how they're going to gain or how they're going to feed, skeletal correctness, balance, design, and skeleton. So those are kind of the main points that we look at and we kind of teach for livestock judging, and some of the things we look at. I would say, I'll go in and kind of break some things down as we work our way through here. But I would say kind of in that order is how we evaluate market hogs. And in a show ring, I would say that majority of the hogs have muscle and they have some width. So it's little differences that kind of sort them, or, base your criteria of what you're going to buy off of maybe some look or some design from the side. So we'll go ahead and dive into a little bit more in detail about each one of these things. So when we talk about product merit is really muscle and finish, the main 2 things that we are looking for in market swine. So some things that we look at in terms of muscle, or where to view muscle, would be their forearm or behind their blade or their shoulder, their loin, at their 10th, which is kind of at their loin or their hip loin junction as they rotate back into their hip. Then we study them from behind. We talk about muscle shape from behind. You talk about hip width, ham, stifle, and base width. And one of the things that I think is very important in teaching some of my kids is that no matter what species you're looking at, if it's a baby pig or a big pig or a cow or anything, you've got to start with some natural width at the ground. Because in order for them to have some width up high or muscle or products, they have to be wide in terms of their skeleton at the surface. Because if you think of it, if they stand really narrow or really flat at the ground, they're not going to have very much foundation or not very much width to open up with up high. So that's one thing that I really have taught a bunch of my kids is to make sure that they start wide at the ground. Because that's going to allow them to have some muscle shape in all those areas that I just discussed there. As you look at the picture here, some of the pictures are maybe just a little bit old school from some of the PowerPoints that we've looked through, but this kind of breaks it down of where we're going to look at in terms of muscle shape. So you can see their forearm there, over their shoulder region, their stifle or their hip from behind. And viewpoints are huge, especially in pigs. You got to study them from the side. You got to get on top of them and make sure you get your viewpoints of them coming right at you and leaving, because I think you can really study muscle shape, from the side in terms of their forearm, but also on top of them when you study down their top line as well. Here's just some muscle comparisons that you guys can kind of visualize and see. The one on the left, it's obvious that that one has more shape, more expression of shape. You can see the muscle definition from behind throughout its hip. And the one on the right, very, very plain and flat in their muscle shape. So you want hogs, so to speak, you want them as wide as you can make them while still being very correct in their skeleton. And I know these pictures are very, very different and vast in terms of their differences, but it really shows a good example of what we're looking for just in terms of muscle definition in baby pigs when you're picking them out on the left compared to the right. And again, like I said earlier, viewpoints are everything. So the slide before, you study them from behind, you can see muscle definition and differences. You can also study them from the side. As you can see here, the gilt there on the left has quite a bit more muscle shape. You can see more muscle shape and definition in terms of her forearm and her shoulder, and all the way back out through her hip. She's got a lot of natural turn and a lot of natural shape out of her hip. Muscle is a round object or a round shape. And so muscle is naturally going to lay onto any kind of species of livestock a little bit rounder or a little bit more shapely out of their hip and down their top as well. As you can see there on the right, that pig or that gilt, not as defined in terms of her muscle shape, a little flatter, a little plainer to look at just in terms of her overall appearance. Again, just a lot of picture examples here that you guys maybe can go back and look through. The one there on the left, although they're very similar, if you want to break down just muscle shape differences from behind and where to view them, the one on the right has a little bit more shape from behind, a little fuller into its outer hip, and just total dimension from behind is better in terms of loin shape, in terms of just width from behind, and the right one compared to the left one. The left one the left barrow is just a little flatter from behind. And again, this goes for baby pigs or even big pigs when you get to the show and kind of some things that the judge are talking about. This is kind of the viewpoints that they'll be looking at. This here is a very extreme example of one that's very, very heavy muscled, very expressive in terms of muscle shape. You can see there when you get right on top of hogs, little or big, you can see muscle shape or lack thereof right behind their shoulder. We talk about back shape or loin shape. That's what they're talking about in behind their shoulder and all the way back out to their loin. And then obviously from behind, this pig right here is very, very shapely from behind, very expressive in terms of its shape. So another key thing that we talk about in terms of market hogs, and really this goes for as you feed your project and as you get them mature or to a heavier weight, we talk about leanness or finish. And areas to pretty much what that means, I guess, is how much fat they have, how much fat, how much condition, how much finish they have. And some of the things or some of the areas you need to look at for that would be their jawline, their blades or their shoulder, their forerib, loin edge, and then lower 1/3 of their body. So all the way from their forerib, especially back into their flank. Their flank will really fill in with fat pretty quickly. And then obviously from behind, you can kind of see through the seam of their ham where they're starting to fill in with some fat as well. We talk about optimal leanness when you get, if your target weight's about 260 to 280 or somewhere in that range for when you show your pigs, there's kind of an optimal amount of leanness that you're kind of shooting for. And I do think that when you go to buy your projects, you can kind of gauge how much feedability that hog's going to have, or maybe how big it's going to get, or how fat you think you can get it. And here, this kind of talks about just having an average amount of finish and fat, also with muscle. You got to kind of have best of both worlds, especially in the show ring, because judges are kind of looking for a proportional hog that's very good and very complete in terms of its finish, but it also has to have enough muscle to counteract that finish. So, this slide kind of just breaks down the optimal amount of both leanness and muscle shape. This picture here kind of shows you the areas that I was talking about in places where you can really view fat. Underneath their chin or their jowl region right there, their shoulder area or forerib and forearm, that kind of ties in one another. To me personally, I think some of the easiest places to study fat would be down their top line and throughout their lower body line. So those are the places that they're going to finish. Animals finish top to bottom, front to rear. So some of the first places they'll start to finish will actually be down their top line and their jowl, and then they'll work their way down and work their way back as well. But that's just kind of a visual indicator of where you can look at some places where your hogs are starting to fill in with fat. Here's some very good examples of correctly finished hogs in terms of just finish and being very proportional in terms of their look. And again, these are big hogs. These are 280, 290 pound barrows. But again, you can actually study this when you're baby pigs and you're going to pick out your projects as well. You can tell, if they're proportional as babies, or they look like they're kind of easy doing and deep bodied, like these two barrows are, then they're going to feed well for you, which is certainly something that you should keep your eye out while you're picking your projects. You don't want one that's really tight bodied or kind of hard doing, because they're typically not going to be as easy keeping or not quite as easy feeding for you as well as you go through your projects. As you look at this next slide, when I talk about hard body shape or kind of not feeding good, these are kind of the images that come to mind. These are very, very extreme. But the white gilt up there is very tight in terms of her body line. She doesn't look like she's going to feed quite as well or be quite as soft and proportional. She just doesn't balance up quite as nicely from the side. And same goes for the Duroc there in the bottom left. Really hard body, just doesn't look like he's fed very good, not really finished correctly as well. Kind of just hard and shallow from his forerib all the way back. Before we go into the skeletal width, I want to make sure, does anybody have any questions so far? If you do, just make sure to put them there in the chat, or you can go ahead and ask. Okay, we'll keep moving on. Can everyone hear me okay? You good? Okay. So we'll talk a little bit about skeletal width. Again, I think skeletal width is huge and very, very important when picking out your projects. skeletal width just determines how wide they are at the ground. So some areas to view skeletal width would be their chest floor, so the front view, their sternum, top and the center part of their blade or their shoulder, their center skeleton, and then their base width going away. So again, viewpoints are huge. When we talk about pigs, get in front of them and study how wide they are, getting behind them and study how wide they are. You really want them to be very square and proportional with each other on both ends of their skeleton. Here's some pictures of some hogs here, some projects that are really base narrow. So if you get in front of these hogs and study their chest width, you can see the one on the top left is really, really closed up in terms of his knee. That's not going to really allow him to have very much muscle shape or very much product. So you can see the belted barrow there on the top right, very, very closed up in terms of his knee, kind of comes in at his knee there, really flat in terms of his shoulder, which again, that's just not going to allow him to have very much muscle shape or very much muscle expression. And same goes for the barrow down low, not as much muscle width, not as much dimension in terms of his body shape. These next pictures, these barrows are very opened up, very wide coming at you. So when we talk about chest width, this is a good example of some chest width in between his shoulders. And same goes for the blue barrow there on bottom. He's very wide chested. And you know, I know they're just pictures, but you can almost imagine how wide they would be going away as well. I bet those barrows are very wide going away and wide when you get right on top of them. And also study them from the side, they're going to have plenty of body shape as well. But that just kind of gives you a visual idea of what we talk about as judges when we talk about, you know, chest width and width going away as well. Again, just some more pictures here that you guys can go back and look through for some examples. The one here on the left, very base narrow from behind. His hocks are very close to each other. And not very wide all the way at the surface. The one on the right is very wide at the surface in terms of base width. And, you know, you can tell the muscle differences between the two. The one on the right is obviously heavier muscled and wider down its top, and especially from out of its ham and stifle shape as well. When we talk about growth indicators, I do think that this is very important as you pick out your projects. Again, any species you go to choose, I think growth and how they're going to feed are two very important things that you should probably pay attention to. You want them to get big. You don't want them to be small their entire life. They got to go home and perform for you and eat. Some growth indicators for hogs is kind of their height of their shoulders and the length of their face. Length of cannon and length of body also play a huge role. You know, to me, length of face and length of cannon is huge, no matter what species you're talking about. If they're really short-faced or really, you know, small in terms of their knee to the ground, they're probably not going to be very big. And you know, on the other side of that, if they're kind of longer faced, a little longer in terms of their cannon bone, they're probably going to get just a little bit bigger. You want somewhere in between. You don't want one that's going to be absolutely huge for you. You don't want one that's going to be really small, very moderate. You kind of want the best of both worlds to say, or kind of an in between of those two extremes. To take, you know, just some visual pictures here, as you can see the one on the left, very extended, very tall shouldered, extended, a little longer in terms of her face. She's going to hit a mature weight and be just a little bit bigger in terms of her frame size than say the one on the right. The bear on the right is an extreme example of one that's very short and very moderate. You can see how short he is in terms of his face. His cannon bone is very short and he's short bodied. He's not going to be as heavy in terms of his weight or his size at the end point compared to the gilt there on the left. Another huge thing is structural design, especially for when we're talking about show ring prospects or show projects as you move forward. You want proper angle and cushion to their shoulder, knee, and pastern. Hip design in terms of length and levelness, and then their tail set. And, why is structure important when we talk about these? Because, obviously you want them to look good in the show ring, but you also need them to be practical for you to feed them. And, there's some specific things that relates just to pigs in terms of structure. You talk about toe size, foot size, and heaviness of skeleton, or how big bone they are. There's some little differences in terms of pigs that kind of make them unique compared to other species. Here's some pictures that actually are very helpful. They're a little old school in terms of pictures, but they're still very helpful just to see what a proper angle should be in terms of a hog. So you can see there the shoulder angle and the blade angle up front has some natural give and set. Down at the knee, they have some natural set as well, very comfortable in terms of their front end skeleton. And then the same goes for from behind. Their hip is kind of, it has some bend and has some set to its hip all the way to hock and down into its pastern. It's very comfortable for the pig it's very good for a pig to be very comfortable in terms of their build and in terms of their design. As you go to the next slide there, you can see the difference in a hog that's very, very straight and upright. You can see how straight it is in terms of its knee and its pastern and all the way back into its hip. You can draw a straight line all the way from its tail to the surface, from its hock to the ground. And that's not a good thing. You need a hog that's going to have some set and some give on both ends of its skeleton, especially as a baby. When you go out to pick your projects, if a hog is maybe a little straight as a baby, they're not probably going to get better as they mature. They're probably going to get worse the heavier they get. So I do think structure is huge when you go out to pick out your projects, regardless of your species you're showing, because you want them to be sound as a baby, and then you also want them to grow up and mature to a heavy weight and still be comfortable. There's also some pictures here when you talk about front end or rear view in terms of their rear leg set. The one there on the left is pretty normal, pretty strong in terms of its pastern, pretty comfortable in terms of its hock. As you work your way to the right there, you can see one that's a little sickle hocked or maybe just a little sharp in terms of its hock placement. The one directly to its right is very post-legged or very straight. And then the one clear on the right is a little too weak pastern. So sometimes you can see pigs that maybe their dew claws go into the dirt or their feet are kind of broken, very soft and kind of ouchy. That's not a good thing, right? You want them to be up in terms of their pastern set, very comfortable and strong in terms of their feet. The front leg, kind of same kind of deal. So the one there on the left is kind of normal, very strong and good in terms of their pastern set. Weak pastern again is when their dew claws are kind of setting into the dirt. And then buck-kneed is one that's kind of over in terms of its knee placement there. And just as important from a side view angle is structure, you also got to get in front of them and get in behind them. As you can see, front leg placement, pigeon-toed and splay-footed. Splay-footed is going out, pigeon-toed is in. And then you have cow hocks when they pull their hocks together. Any one of these things kind of make the hog uncomfortable when it moves. So again, this kind of all relates back to being very square and very opened up in terms of their skeletal width, which will allow them to just be very comfortable in terms of movement. This is a very, very dramatic example of one that's incorrect in terms of their skeleton. Very straight from behind, very straight in terms of its shoulder and not comfortable. Again, this hog is just not comfortable in the way it moves, and you don't even have to see him move to tell that. They're just way too straight in terms of its angle and just skeletal build there. We talk about balance, some balance things that kind of go hand in hand with skeleton and width. Balance kind of encompasses everything. This hog here is very, very balanced. It's strong and level down its top line. It's square and good out of its hip. And it also has some height of shoulder and height all the way out to its hip. Everything kind of matches. I kind of break everything into thirds per se from the side, and all three of these thirds kind of fit together, right? There's nothing that's really thrown off anywhere or throws off its balance. This here, I have several picture examples here. This one here is also a very nicely balanced hog, maybe just a little rounder, a little shorter out of its hip. But I think the front 2/3 of that one's balance is very, very good in comparison to the one we just saw, maybe just a little shorter out of its hip. And these are all things that you can look at for hogs that weigh 280 or even one that weighs 60 pounds when you're going to pick them out from your breeders. Here's some pictures of some hogs that are very off in terms of their balance, kind of high in terms of their top line, tighter in terms of their body shape. I do think body shape plays a huge role in terms of balance and proportions as well. Again, it kind of encompasses all the good things that we've talked about in terms of balance and proportionality. And again, here's just a couple more picture of examples. Both these hogs are very nice in terms of their balance. Their length of back kind of matches their length up front and their length out of their hip as well. And again, this is kind of from a judge's standpoint is very important when the little things matter. We talk about balance and proportionality as well. So I believe the last slide here for our swine presentation is just kind of a brief guide in terms of ear notching, which is super important, especially when you go out to pick out your projects. So the right ear number, or the right pig's right ear, I can't talk today, is their litter number. So that's going to determine that breeder how many litters they have. If they have 50 litters a year and this pig is litter number 33 or 34, that is litter number 33 of the year for that breeder. It's very important. They don't have ear tags for pigs. Litter notching is super important. And then the left ear there is the pig's individual number. So you can see there in the picture, you have a 139. And then on the litter number, you have 1, 3, 81, 9, and 27. So a pig can have up to 2 notches in each section. And then you add them all together, and that's going to give you a number something similar to 34-2. So that pig would be a 34 litter, and it would be the second pig in that litter. So it's just a way to identify pigs that pig breeders use. It's something very, very important to know and kind of memorize. You know, at first it might seem like it's a lot, and it might take a little bit of practice, but it is huge as you go forward with your projects to kind of learn and to know how to read ear notches. With that being said, I believe that's all we have for the hog presentation. Do we have any questions from anybody about any of the pig stuff?
I don't have anything in the chat yet. We'll pull through here, and I will second you guys the ear notches. It is okay if you use that little cheat sheet. Literally just have, as a parent, pull it up on your phone or keep it in your record book. Your hogs will need to be notched in order to be eligible to show. So when you go to buy your hogs, make sure that the producer has done that, because most counties and state fair for sure, to nominate them, you have to have notches in those ears. And then just also remember a lot of the stuff Kyndal was talking about, especially when it came to structure and everything like that. Not only does having proper structure help your animal build muscle more balanced, but remember that your animals, you're going to have to slowly get your animals in shape, and they're potentially going to have to be walking and driving and working for you for 30 minutes in a showmanship class and stuff like that. And if they don't have the proper structure and they're not comfortable, like Kyndal was saying, then they're going to A, run out of energy faster, and B, they're going to start moving like they're hurting because they might be hurting. And so that's another reason to keep in mind having that correct structure. So what do you guys have questions on? What pictures can we go back to? So Kyndal, if I were gonna go, or if any of these kids were gonna go to a sale this weekend, and they hopefully got the opportunity, whether they're going to a sale or a producer, to watch the animals ahead of time. Would you recommend they watch them move, they see them from every angle, and then like if you had to pick the top 3 things to look at to compare one young pig to another young pig, what would be those top things that just make it a little bit easier to kind of prioritize them?
Yeah, so everyone's views are a little bit different, but from my experience and just raising a few pigs and feeding them, some of the 3 most important things I look at as baby pigs is, 1, their skeleton and how they're built. They've got to be able to be sound and be functional in order to put on weight and grow to 280 and make it to your show. So I love to watch pigs move around and study how wide they are, how skeletally correct they are, how square they are, and how comfortable they are. So kind of skeleton, mobility, skeletal width, all in one. Some other things that I look at, how much muscle they're going to have, how much actual width, or how stout they are in terms of muscle shape from their shoulder all the way out to their hip. And then I would say the third thing is kind of balance. Just their eye appeal and their look from the side, especially on show hogs. It's becoming very, very competitive. And so you want to make sure you have a pig that has some look to them, has some proportionality, tall shouldered, flat down their top line, and just kind of have that show ring presence about them from the side. So I would say in that order is probably the way that I analyze baby pigs when you go to the sales or maybe go to a breeder's house to choose a project.
Thank you. All right, you guys, any questions? If not, I know we've got a couple people on for lambs and goats. So if we don't have any hog questions, we will go ahead and roll on to lambs and goats. But again, good luck selecting your hogs. The one last thing I will say is potentially a misconception, especially from new families, is those big butts and that muscling and everything. It is not, if your animal does not have that to some extent, the shape you're looking for when you're buying them, they're not going to magically get that really nice, really nice round shape from behind and those types of things just with exercise necessarily. Exercise will help, feed will help, but there is a difference in show hog genetics versus just commercial hog genetics. And with the commercial hogs, meaning those hogs that are raised to just go straight from being fed to slaughter, they're not necessarily being shown in a show ring. You see a lot less of that round shape. Kyndal, hopefully I'm not speaking incorrectly here, but I do see and it's perfectly fine to go buy a commercial hog as your project animal, absolutely. But don't go buying one who has absolutely no shape when you're looking at them from behind, thinking that you can exercise a nice big booty onto them, because genetically it can only go so far.
Yep, I would totally.
All right, perfect. Well, with that, Kyndal, we will, if you're ready to move on to lambs and goats, and if any questions come in with hogs, then we can jump back to them. So,
yeah, perfect. So I've kind of combined market lamb and goat evaluation kind of into one PowerPoint here, because I do think a lot of the things are exactly the same for both. So as we work forward here, just some things, some priorities that we kind of look at. And again, I know I probably sound like a broken record talking from the pigs to this, but a lot of the similar things are very consistent within species. So potential carcass value when we talk about sheep and goats would obviously compare or combine muscularity and correctness of finish, the two most important things of any kind of market animals, regardless of species. We talk about handling quality. At shows, sheep and goats are the only ones that are kind of handled. Steers occasionally, but handle quality is huge for the sheep and the goats. Weight and extension, that kind of goes hand in hand with size and how they're going to grow and feed for you. And then skeletal correctness, the balance, the attractiveness, and the structure things that we talked about previously in the hog section. So some areas to identify muscle in sheep and goats is their forearm, again, their shoulder area, their rack, which their rack is right behind their shoulder when the judges handle the sheep or the goats over their top line. That's kind of their rack. And then we work their way into their loin shape, hip, which is from behind, and then their leg. So you can study leg shape from behind or also from the side when we talk about muscle dimension and definition through their leg. So you can see here, so here again, I'm all about pictures and kind of visualizing what we're talking about. These two pictures here are very, very powerfully constructed, heavy muscled sheep. You can see the definition into their lower leg and even over their rack and into their loin. And goats, it's the exact same kind of thing. When we talk about shape from behind or shape down their top line and into their loin, you always trust your eyes first, and then let your hands just reconfirm what you're seeing with your eyes. And again, muscle is a round shape, and you can see some round shapes and some round textures to both of these sheep and some expression and definition to their lower leg and stifle there. These are light muscled sheep examples here. You can see a dramatic difference from the previous pictures compared to these. They're very flat in terms of their top and very flat from behind. They look kind of shallow in terms of their leg shape there, and just kind of flat everywhere, especially through their shoulder. Again, very, very visual in terms of muscle shape in sheep and goats because they are sheared. And shorn so tight so that you can really see everything. There's not much to hide in sheep and goats in terms of muscle shape and expression, both from the side and from behind and in front of the animal is very important in sheep and goats. Again, here's a little picture example of just some differences, and it really describes the differences that we look at in terms of a judge's standpoint of describing muscle shape. And again, you study this as they're babies or when you're buying them at a sale, and kind of as they progress forward. If they don't have it when they're little, they're probably not going to get much more when they grow up. And so you can see there left, that one's very thick in terms of its leg, very stout in terms of its muscle shape up high. As we work our way to the right, that one there directly to its right is a little flatter, a little plainer in terms of its leg shape. And same kind of goes for the one directly to its right there, the third one in, very flat and shallow in terms of its twist. So when we talk about twist, that's a view from behind in terms of kind of its crotch area and how deep or how shallow it is there in terms of its inner leg. And then the one there on the far right, very muscular and expressive in terms of its shape. You can see some muscle definition from behind and also down their top line as you study them from behind. Whoops.
Sorry about that, Kyndal. Let me get you back where you needed to be.
No,
I was trying to
you're
unmute myself and it did not work properly. I did have a question on the twist. So you're talking it's in this region as far as, is it how their leg is connecting basically from like their stifle to their crotch, or can you explain a little bit more on that and what is ideal on that?
Yeah, so when I say twist, I'm kind of talking from the top of their dock where they're docked all the way down, just straight down. So that's depth or shallowness of twist. And so the deeper they are is more ideal because it's going to mean they're a little wider, a little deeper and fuller from behind. So if they're really shallow in terms of their twist length, I guess, would kind of throw off their balance. It would typically means they're a little lighter muscled. And also, if they're deeper twisted, sometimes they're able to finish just a little bit better as well in terms of fat cover.
Thank you.
Yep. All right, so when we talk about some finish differences in terms of sheep and goats, this is directly for sheep. So goats actually do not have a yield grades or grading system, but for sheep, there is a yield grading system. So upon harvest, or when you, at the end point, there are goals that you want to meet with your sheep project. So the ideal fat thickness range is about 0.15 to about 0.25 in terms of fat thickness. For yield grades, you're going to get discounts for yield grades 4s and 5s. So what I mean by that is if your sheep get too fat and light muscled, they're not going to be very optimal in terms of their yield grade. So you really shoot for a good combination of fat, finish, and muscle shape, just like in the pigs. Blend the balance of both together. So again, with that, you don't want your lambs to be too fat. You also don't want them to be too thin either. Lambs with less than 0.15 in terms of fat thickness are typically harder feeding sheep. And that kind of goes for goats as well. You want them to have some natural flesh, some natural feeding ability to go ahead and put on that fat that's necessary for them to harvest very properly. Again, stale tops are equally as bad as fat and shelf tops. So this is kind of something we teach our judging kids. You want sheep and goats to be very fresh in terms of their muscle shape and their finish. And so when you handle your sheep or you handle your goats, even as young prospects, you want them to have some firmness. You want them to have some touch and some tone. You don't want them to be really soft or too hard. You want them to be kind of firm and very, very consistent in terms of their handling quality for fat and finish. When we talk about correctly finished and just some picture examples, you can see how proportional these sheep are. And again, it goes for goats as well. You want them to be very consistent in terms of their chest all the way back into relation to their flank, and very smooth down their top line as well. I think sheep are, and really goats, are very hard to keep very smooth down their top line. And so when you pick them out, if they're kind of, rough down their top line or rocky down their top line, or kind of start high and then go down really low and steep out of their hip, that's kind of throws off some of their balance. And if you go there to the next slide, you can kind of tell this one's very underfinished, and it also kind of throws off his balance. So you can see how hard and just raw in terms of its body shape it is, not quite as smooth down its top line. As that sheep progresses and gets a little fatter, it'll become smoother down its top line and more proportional to look at from the side. But that one's just way too underfinished and just very juvenile in terms of its look, in terms of its body shape. And then if you go to the next slide, that's also an example of the other extreme. You don't want sheep or goats to be too heavy in terms of their finish or too fat. These sheep are getting very fat, and you can tell they're getting, although they look pretty smooth, you can see in terms of their body shape and just their lower body balance how off it is from their chest back into relation to their flank. The biggest part of their body is the mid part of their back and the mid part of their body shape. What I teach my judging kids is sheep or goats, you don't want them to be shaped like a boat. You want them to progressively get wider when you view them down their top line from their shoulder all the way out to their hip. And you want them to progressively deepen from their chest and deepen back into their flank. So we talk about sheep and goats wedging correctly. That's kind of from a judge's standpoint is what we're talking about in terms of progressively widening or progressively deepening from the side.
Is that something that you can kind of see structurally at a young age, or is that something that really is just going to come as they grow and feed out?
Yeah, I would say you can definitely pick it out as prospects. it kind of goes with their build and kind of their skeletal makeup. You want them, sheep and goats especially, to have some width, both at the ground and up high. Because if they don't start wide or big in terms of their body shape, they're not going to be able to get much wider. So they've got to start with all the right parts and pieces when you go and pick them out, just in terms of width and body shape and total mass. That way they can progressively get wider as they go forward.
Thank you.
We talk about weight and extension for both sheep and goats. They're sold by the pound. So, you know, when we talk about big sheep, you want them to be big, or even goats as well, but they've also got to have some width to go hand in hand with it. It's just like cattle or just like swine. They've got to have the best of both worlds in terms of muscle shape, width, product, while also fitting kind of their size and total extension. And kind of what we talked about in the pigs, you want the sheep and goats to have some grow to them. You want them to get to an optimal weight and size, but at the same time, you don't want them to get too framey or too big on you, or maybe short and dumpy and not reach the maximum potential. So some of the things in terms of extension to look at are just length of body, you know, length of cannon, how extended they are from their shoulder forward. It's very, very similar to the pigs. This is kind of how you determine how your sheep or your goat project are going to grow. Another important thing is skeletal correctness. So when we talk about skeletal correctness, you want them to be square on all corners. Their chest floor needs to be elevated. Skeletal strength. So again, they've got to have some strength at their pastern set. You want them to be square out of their hock and pastern as well from behind. You want them to be very youthful in terms of their rib cage and chest floor. And then heaviness of structure. You want them to be very stout in terms of their bone work and their foot size. You don't want one that's really, really stout, really muscular up high, but really frail at the ground. You want them to have some heavy duty structure and bone work and foot size as well at the surface. Here's a sheep that's very correct in terms of its skeletal assembly. You can see it's very square from its hock all the way to the surface, very square and elevated up front in terms of height of shoulder. And you can see down its top line there, its height of shoulder goes straight back and very level from hooks to pins as well, or out of its hip and docket from behind. This one's very square in terms of its structure. You can see from behind, it stands very square and very uniform from behind. And yet up front, you can see that sheep has some chest width and has some natural width, which allows it to have some muscle shape all the way through. And again, this goes for goats as well. You want them to be wide and you want them to be square up front and kind of maintain that same width all the way from behind as well. This one is an example of one that's way too sharp in terms of its hock set, or too much set to its hock. You can see it's very, very behind its kind of framework there and its stance, and not very attractive to look at from the side. You want those to be very square and very comfortable in terms of their hock placement. That one just stands a little too sharp, a little too much set to its hock. And you can imagine how that one would move. And that kind of goes for prospects when you're buying them too. You don't want them to be too sharp or too underneath themselves. This one's really weak in terms of its loin and kind of bucked over in terms of its knee. This is really important when you go to show your sheep and goat projects. You want to hold them together in terms of their loin, very strong down their top line, like we've talked about. And you can see that one just gets a little weak, a little rocky down its top line. And you know, that problem started when it was a baby. I assume that one wasn't comfortable enough in terms of its loin, and it only progressively got worse as that sheep got older. And really the same exact thing goes for goats as well. This one is very high in terms of its spine. Again, throws off its balance and kind of its structural makeup from the side. Just not comfortable. And you know, when that sheep moves, That one probably gets worse in terms of its top line. It gets up in terms of its top line, I bet, and just not comfortable in motion. We talk about rib design in sheep and goats, very important in terms of skeletal width and kind of encompassing all of the things in terms of proportions and balance. That one's very useful and round in terms of its body shape. You want sheep and goats, when you pick them out, to have a round and useful body shape design. And I know these are just pictures, so it's kind of hard to see and explain, but you want them to have a really round forerib shape all the way back out through its hip. And that's only going to allow it to not only feed better for you, but also to get wider and allow that top shape to get really wide as well.
So Kyndal, when you're referring to that, like if we were looking at it from behind or kind of behind and on top, you're saying we're looking for, my screen's doing weird things. We're looking for more of a this shape in its rib rather than like a more triangular shape, or what if we were to break it down into those basics?
Yeah, so I mean, you want it to be round. You want it to look like they almost swallowed a watermelon or something, you know, open it up really round and big in terms of its barrel shape. You don't want it to be very flat or kind of straight up and down or very vertical in terms of its body shape. You want it to be as round bodied as you can make it, because again, the wider they are from the ground up, including their body shape, the wider they can be in terms of muscle. So if they're really flat and one-dimensional in terms of their body, they're not going to have a lot of foundational width up high to put any muscle shape on, which relates to handling quality. So yeah, you just want it to be as round and kind of circular as possible.
Perfect. Thank you.
When we talk about mature in terms of their rib cage, this is kind of when you want them to look youthful. As you can see here, we talked about lower body balance. This sheep right here is very, very deep in terms of its chest and its breastplate, which throws off its balance. You want the deepest part of the sheep or the goat to be back into their flank, and that one kind of progressively gets the wrong way. Its tightest part of its lower body is its flank, and the deepest part is its chest. And so that kind of throws off that one's balance, makes it look just a little bit more mature in terms of its look. We talk about tight in terms of rib design. Again, this very shallow in terms of their forerib shape. Their lower body's kind of thrown off, and it kind of correlates to their top design as well. These sheep are very kind of rough in terms of their top line, not as comfortable in terms of their top line or their hip as well. And I think that's it for the sheep and goat portion. If you guys have questions, please feel free to ask away.
All right, we'll wait and see if we've got stuff pulling through on the chat, or you guys are welcome to unmute as well. Just a few things on the 4-H side when you are purchasing or selecting your goats and your sheep, make sure that they have scrapies tags in the ear. It may somewhat vary county to county as far as what the requirements are for scrapies tags, but I believe State Fair is scrapies tag required, and very many counties require scrapies tags, even if they are market wethers. So it's just easier to make sure the producer has put that scrapies tag in their ear. And then also with all of these animals, you guys work with your 4-H leaders or work with your extension agents if you're not sure what weight you should be buying your animal at, because you should be going in with an idea of what weight to buy these animals at, because some of them that are going to be younger are obviously going to be lighter. Some of them that are heavier or older might be heavier. So you can calculate that out based on what your weight requirements are at your county fair and what the average animal in that species will gain per day. So have your 4-H leaders help you calculate that out, so you don't go to sales or to producers in the next couple of weeks and buy something that is too young and simply has a very small chance of finishing by the time you make fair, or vice versa, you get something that is so large, especially with the hogs, that you're going to go overweight and you won't be eligible to sell. So most county fairs have maxes, especially on hogs.